Hello, I'd like to talk about nutrition today. I'm going to use hip fracture as a model for the care that we offer to frail older people in hospital and draw on my experience over many years now looking after this group of patients in Cardiff. And I have to pay tribute to Donna Duncan, who's the senior dietitian who took me under her wing when I first arrived in Cardiff and taught me much of what I'm going to teach you, and who was the inspiration for many of the projects and the collaborative work that I'm going to talk about in this rapid whiz through nutrition as a topic. When we're at medical school, we get fed these long lists of nutrients that we need to think about and understand and worry about the implications of individual deficiencies. And I have to say I've used had little or no need to go back to those since I left medical school. Nice guidance on nutrition is much more about recognition and definition of people who are malnourished and some of the strategies that one might use to provide additional feeding mechanisms. And a lot of our clinical work builds on this into discussion of the ethics and the practicalities of enteral feeding regimes and parenteral feeding. But all of that is pretty irrelevant to the general public. The general public's perspective on nutrition is that we do it really badly in hospital, and there's constantly in the press and on the radio, on television, accounts of people not getting fed in hospital and the implications of that for them and their family. And they're right to be worried, because Linda Fried's seminal paper on frailty drew this picture of a spiral of decline where poor nutrition leads to muscular weakness, sarcopenia, which reduces patients' function, their ability to be independent, their ability to feed themselves, to eat, and a spiral of decline that we need to break if we're to improve their outcome, particularly their time in hospital. So when I first started in Cardiff and wondered what I could do for my patients with hip fracture, I went to the Cochrane Library, go and talk to the experts, and the experts had done lots of trials, and there's huge numbers of trials of bits of exciting metal that you can put into people's hips, lots of trials of anaesthesia, but there are also lots of trials of nutritional supplementation. There's probably twice as many as this now in the Cochrane Library if you go and look at it. So lots of trials. The problem with those trials is they're not funded by implant manufacturers and drug manufacturers, so they're small trials of relatively poor quality. And they address a number of possible strategies for feeding people in hospital, giving multi-nutrient supplements, protein calorie supplements in particular, coming to fairly vague suggestions that this might be helpful but unconvincing. And this sort of trial is the reason why they're unconvincing. Published in The Lancet, despite just 59 patients, and fewer deaths at 6 months, but not significant because of that size of trial. So, or protein supplementation, there have been other trials coming to similar vague conclusions, and nasogastric feeding has been studied in 4 trials, had then been studied in 4 trials, didn't seem to make a difference. It seemed logical that if you can pour food in through a nasogastric tube into somebody, you can improve their nutritional state and their outcome. But of course, with the frail, confused older people that we're dealing with, pouring food into them through their nose is likely to lead to worsening of confusion, and the challenge of delirium is something I'll talk about in a different talk. There are suggestions it might be beneficial, but the people who are likely to be in these trials excluded those with dementia. So not really tackling the group of patients who I'd be most concerned about at the best of times. And in the real world, we know that nutrition is going to have to make a difference. As Donna told me, if you don't recognise the importance of nutrition, then you don't understand hip fracture. And there's no doubt that if you had to choose between one of these legs and the other to try and get back onto after breaking your hip, it's the well-nourished one that's going to be the one that you go for. So Donna and I ran a whole sequence of studies and projects looking at nutrition during our time in hospital. The first thing we did was to look to see whether the patients who were malnourished using the mini-nutritional assessment did less well. And as we showed, essentially mortality is confined to the group of patients who were already malnourished when they presented to hospital. Problem with the M&A is that it requires you to weigh people, which is a little bit challenging in a patient who's bedbound with a broken hip. So Donna developed this WASP score, which looks at patients' weight, how they're eating, their ability to eat, stress factors, and hip fractures a major stress factor, and wounds and pressure areas, and to pulls those together to give you a sense of patients' individual risk. A simple set of questions rather than requiring you to weigh the patient, and she was able to demonstrate again that those malnourished on that were the ones who were likely to die following a hip fracture. So we could see that our patients were coming in malnourished, that there were obviously difficulties in making sure they were fed in hospital, and we needed to support them. So we routinely decided to provide multinutrient supplements to everybody, regardless of their nutritional state. We routinely performed a nutritional risk assessment using the WASP score to identify people who needed additional attention. And then we had a very blanket policy of aggressive support being available. Nobody had to agree. We didn't have to ask the orthopaedic surgeons whether they minded putting a nasogastric tube into their patients. We got on and did it as and when we identified people as being at high risk, and felt frightfully pleased that we developed a strategy for dealing with nutrition. Then, one summer holiday, we co-opted a couple of nutritional students, dietetic students, to come work on the ward, and their job was to weigh the food going to the patients and weigh the plate when it came back, to identify the full construct of the food that people were being offered and eating during their time in hospital. And then using the back of the Weetabix packet sort of calculation of patients' recommended daily allowances, and comparing what they were eating to that, patients were eating about 50% of what they needed to survive during their time in the hospital. So in spite of our proactive approach to nutrition, we were still running people on half what they needed to cope with. Supplements were playing a part in that, but even with supplementation, people were getting less than half the energy and only about half the protein that they needed to make a recovery. So there's a real challenge there. So we have this Duracell concept of nutrition for these patients. They come into hospital with their batteries often quite run down for nutritional reasons, and poor nutrition, muscle weakness and so on are going to precipitate falls and risk of fracture in the first place. And then while they're in hospital, we don't charge them up again. We leave them gradually running down. So we need to do something more about that. One of the concerns that we have is that if you look at what happens at meal times, the food that patients are being offered is quite poor. The money that's spent by individual hospitals on food is trivial compared to the amount I can spend on a single ward round prescribing on somebody's drug chart. Absolutely trivial compared to the cost of some of the implants that surgeons are putting into these patients. Tiny amounts of money being spent, and that budget being pared away little by little as time goes, and cost improvements have to be achieved, so that patients lose their bedtime milky drink, they lose their snack at tea time or coffee time during the ward day. And re-engineering the hospital menus was something that Donna championed to make sure that there were more choices there that might be suitable to people who couldn't use a knife and fork, for instance, that the snacks were reintroduced, that we started putting protein and energy back into the sort of things that people actually did eat when they were in hospital. Not a pretty spectacle, but actually the soup that people were eating at lunchtime, you could see the bottom of the bowl. It was clear soup. So putting some protein back into it made a whole lot of sense, rather than them just getting salt and water, which was what was so often what the meal was offering. And you can see again an improvement between 2000 and 2001 in the intake of patients, simply because we changed the way that the type of food that was being offered to them in hospital. But this remains a challenging area. So the catering staff who bring food around to the patients are catering staff. They're not nurses. The way in which people are fed is not integrated with the way in which those patients should be looked after. And Lindsay Bradley, who's staff nurse on my ward, created this concept of the red tray, which many of you will have seen around the UK as a standard approach to improving nutrition for hospitals. So rather than catering staff bringing a tray to a patient at a mealtime and then taking it away after the meal, there was a recognition that for patients who had nutritional concerns, it should be the nurse's responsibility to be ensuring that the food the patient is supported to eat, that the food that they're eating is monitored, that the tray is only taken away when the patient's had a chance to eat it, that the tray isn't left by somebody who's asleep and then taken away while they're still asleep, as does happen, and I'm sure we've all seen that sort of thing happening. So that approach got a lot of attention in the nursing literature, and I think is something that, if you haven't taken nutrition seriously, is a very simple thing to introduce into your ward. But this remains an industrial scale process of feeding people in hospital on relatively low budgets. And it's not the way that my mother would want to look after her mother when her mother's admitted to hospital. And that's the problem that next cropped up in my ward. My grandmother was admitted to my ward with a broken hip. And scarily, my mother appeared with her, with the avowed intent of ensuring that her mum was fed properly during her time in hospital. And she hadn't seen the graph showing that her somewhat malnourished mother was at increased risk. She hadn't seen the graphs suggesting that the food that we're offering in hospital is half what mum would have needed. But she knew that nutrition was important, and she came in to deal with that. And the inspiration of watching them together, and it's only when healthcare applies to your family that you really start to look at it from the other side. The inspiration of watching the two of them together was the inspiration for a randomized controlled trial that we ran. Both my mother and my grandmother were members of the WRVS, and the WRVS was created during the war to feed people with soup kitchens. But in recent years, the WRVS around the country, it's now the Royal Voluntary Service around the country, provides support in hospitals and in other settings in a variety of ways. In our hospital, they push a trolley around selling sweets and snacks to patients who are in hospital. And the money that they were making from that, the WRVS in the hospital said that they would give to us to employ nutritional assistants, dietetic assistants, to work with patients on the hip fracture ward. And because we audit all our patients in the ward, we've got good outcome data for them, good detail of their care. We said, well, okay, if you're going to give us that staff, we'll put them into a randomized controlled trial. So this is the cheapest randomized controlled trial you'll ever hear of, and the only ones that are funded by a voluntary agency within a hospital. And the task that we set, the dietetic assistants that they'd employed, two people who came in the middle of the morning, stayed for lunchtime and supper time on the ward, supporting patients. We gave them the task of doing what my mum would have done for the individual patients. So trying to provide a compassionate and straightforward practical approach to supporting people who are in hospital. So they had to collect information, support the dietitian to make good assessments, to work out who's at high risk and might need specific attention, to check that the cultural preferences, that the food, I don't like this. My grandmother, to her dying day, always viewed a plate of pasta as something, I'm not eating that. That sort of challenge you need somebody to take seriously on the ward. They coordinated meals orders so that patients got the food that they might be prepared to eat. They made sure that the supplements were provided in front of the patients and open and available, and patients were encouraged to take them. And they helped patients to choose the right things for them at the time of their meals. And for the frailest of patients, they would sit with them, encourage them, and if necessary, feed people during their time on the ward. So very practical support, as a consequence of which the nutritional intake for patients increased quite markedly, particularly in terms of the supplementary feeds. But it wasn't really the supplementation that was the be-all and end-all of this interaction. We had somebody there as with a relative who was interested in the patient, who spoke to the patient, talked to them, turned a meal from a chore in hospital to being an event that the patient looked forward to and enjoyed. The interaction between them and the patients was hugely important to morale, and the interrelationship between poor nutrition and poor mood, poor morale, poor motivation and poor recovery is very much more complicated than I think I'd understood before this. But with that support, the patient's satisfaction with their time in hospital, their nutrition during their time in hospital improved substantially. But that wasn't the way that we designed this RCT. This was an RCT designed around outcome. And what we were able to show was that the patients who got nutritional support during their time in hospital died less often. We halved mortality at all endpoints for this randomized controlled trial, which you can read about in Age and Aging. So nutritional support can have a bigger impact than any other intervention that anybody's ever done a trial of following hip fracture. It really does matter. Am I arguing that everyone should go away and get dietetic assistance? Well, maybe not, and certainly around the world, dietetic assistance probably irrelevant in many countries because the family come in with the patients and are central to the care of those patients in hospital. With COVID in the UK, that we were in a completely different situation now, with families really almost never in hospital to support the patients in the way that we might want. So what I think the trial demonstrates is that if you take nutritional support away from patients, if you don't give them this support, if this stops being part of nurse care, you're going to double mortality. But this is a practical and a reversible risk for patients in hospital, and something we really can do something about. Does it work in other hospitals? Well, the Health Foundation funded the HipQuip projects run by Northumbria, which co-opted 5 hospitals into a quality improvement collaborative. They looked at a range of aspects of patient care around the perioperative period, surgical care, anaesthetic care, and that sort of thing. But the flagship element of the HipQuip project was the appointment of dietetic assistants in each of the hospitals to change attitudes to feeding during time in hospital. And the dietetic assistant pictured here put together a tea party setting for the patients, changing the attitudes of the wards, changing wards' perception of how important nutrition was, changing patient morale, obviously. Did it work? To copy some of the interventions that we used in our RCT, well, this is the outcome for the 5 hospitals in the HipQuip collaborative. You can see a steady improvement in mortality from above the national average to below the national average, not seen in control hospitals which didn't have that intervention. This is something that is logical, it's popular, it's going to be effective. We've got evidence for it, and it's scalable to other hospitals and obviously not just to hip fracture patients. So nutrition is really important for our patients. And though we spend our time worrying about the medicine, the surgical procedures that we're offering to patients, I can't overemphasize how important nutrition is as a fundamental part of things working on the ward. And there's absolutely is a reason for us not to be trying to do ward rounds and interfering with patients at the time that they're meant to be eating during their time in hospital. Nutrition really matters far more than anything else that we can achieve for them.